So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward to where we begin our class tonight on the date that the book was written. We have here two widely held views, even among members of the church. A lot of members of the church think that it was written in what we call the early date, probably during Nero's reign from 65 to 69 AD. And then there are many who look at the late date as being the correct date that it was written, which would be during Domitian's reign and from 95 to 98 AD. And that's the view I hold, and I'll give you the evidence why I believe that's true. But like I said last time, I'm not going to be dogmatic about anything in Revelation. I'll present the evidence to you as well as I can and as well as I know it, and you draw your own conclusions and make up your own mind. I know some brethren that I love and respect very highly that hold to the early date, and but I also know of many brethren whom I love and respect highly who hold to the late date. So we'll go through the date and let you decide for yourself. The evidence that we'll consider is both external and internal. And by external evidence, I mean evidence that's not included in the scriptures themselves. Any evidence that you consider in religious matters that's not taken from the scriptures is external evidence. And then, of course, the internal evidence will be Scripture itself, things that the Scriptures mention, and that they give internal evidence to support something. And so we're going to be looking at both external and internal evidence for the date of writing. And we're going to look at the conditions set forth in the book of Acts. Of course, since we'll be looking at Acts, that's internal evidence. And but we'll be looking at the conditions set forth in Acts because that's the only history book we have in the New Testament. But it's a history composed by Luke, who was not an apostle, but I certainly believe was inspired in writing the book of Acts to Theophilus. He sets forth a lot of facts that we're going to consider as evidence. And then we're going to look at Nero's persecution, because Nero did persecute the Christians that were in Rome. Now, his persecution, we have no evidence at all that his persecution extended outside of Rome, but only inside of Rome. And of course the reason for that was precipitated by the fact that he got blamed for setting fire to Rome in 64 AD. But before Rome burned, we see that Nero did not hold any animosity towards the church. In fact, he set Paul free in about 62 or 63 AD. Paul was a prisoner in Rome. He had appealed to Caesar. His case came up before Nero, and Nero released him, which tells us that before Rome burned, Nero, who was the emperor of Rome, did not have any animosity towards the church, which I think is very important. But of course, once Rome burned and Nero was blamed for setting fire to the city, then in order to deflect that blame away from himself, he blamed the Christians. And of course, this was in the Roman city limit type of thing, because it was the Christians in Rome, which there was a great number of Christians in Rome. There was a church to Rome that Paul wrote, which was composed almost entirely of Gentiles. And then there was a great number of Jews who were converted to Christianity while Paul was there for 2 years evangelizing among the Jews. And it stated that there were 7 synagogues in Rome, 7 different synagogues throughout the city, and about half of them were converted to Christianity. And I think the book of Hebrews bears this out, because Hebrews was written about 68 AD, and then in Hebrews 10, 32 and 36, let's just go over there and read that, because it's internal evidence that supports the fact that there was no general persecution against Christians as late as 68 AD, which is when Hebrews was written, about 68 AD. So in Hebrews 10, 32 through 36, the Hebrews writer states, "Call to remembrance the former days in which, after ye were illuminated, ye endured a great fight of affliction. Partly, whilst ye were made a gazing stock, both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly whilst ye became companions of them that were so used. For ye had compassion of me and my bonds, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods, knowing in yourselves that ye have in heaven a better and an everlasting substance. Cast not away therefore your confidence, which hath great recompense of reward, for ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God ye might receive the promise." So the Hebrews writer here is exhorting these Hebrew Christians, which were Jewish Christians, not to leave Christianity and go back into Judaism, which is what they were contemplating. In fact, that's the whole purpose the book of Hebrews was written, was to give them arguments as to why they shouldn't do that. And so he tells them to remember back earlier when they first began to be persecuted to some extent. Now, what made them be persecuted? Well, in 64, when Rome burned and Nero blamed the Christians, it's the Gentile Christians, the Gentile church in Rome that suffered. And many, many of them were put to death. In fact, we'll look at some evidence a little bit later of thousands of Christians in Rome were put to death, every conceivable way. But we know that none of them were Hebrew Christians. These were Gentile Christians, because look in chapter 12, verse 4 of Hebrews. In chapter 12, verse 4, the writer says, "Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin." That means that none of them had died for their Christian faith. They had suffered some persecution. Well, why did they suffer any persecution at all? It's because they had compassion on those Gentile Christians who were suffering, and when they showed compassion for them, then they received some persecution themselves, but not to the death. You see the difference there? Because they had not. And this was in 68 when Hebrews was written, which was about 4 years after Rome was burned. And that's when Nero in 66 had gone to Greece. In 68 he came back. And that's when it looked like the Apostle Peter was put to death, and of course the Apostle Paul was rearrested because he had been released in about 62, 63. He evidently went on to Spain and came back into Asia Minor and was rearrested probably somewhere in Macedonia and put in prison again, and that's when he wrote 2 Timothy. And he asked Timothy to hurry and try to come before winter. Well, we don't know if Timothy made it or not, but that's when Paul was put to death, and this was probably 68. So we have this evidence, this internal evidence in the book of Hebrews, where probably this persecution did not go outside of Rome. It was confined in Rome mainly against the Gentiles. Now, in 68, there were some Jews put to death. Peter was one of them, and Paul was one of them. And we know when we get to studying Revelation that there may have been more because that some had died, and we'll see that because John saw the souls of those that had been beheaded for the cause of Christ and for their testimony under the altar, crying out, "How long, O Lord, wilt thou not avenge our death?" And of course, which indicates they had been waiting for their death to be avenged for some time. But if that was written in 95 AD, which I think it was, then there were some years between 68 and 95, about 32 years there, where a lot of persecutions took place, even outside of Rome. And we'll get into that a little bit more a little later on. So this evidence about Nero's persecution seems to be confined to Rome. And so we come to Domitian's persecution. Domitian began to reign in the 90s, about 93 or so. We'll get into the exact date. I don't recall it right off the top of my head. But he succeeded his brother Titus, and it's believed that he probably poisoned Titus and killed him in order that he might become the emperor. He became emperor in 81, and he was emperor until 96. And Titus was put to death, or he died in 81, and Domitian took his place. They were brothers. So in Domitian's reign, he began to persecute Christians outside of Rome. And this stemmed from two things mainly. One was his tremendous desire to be worshipped, and we'll get into that more later, where he demanded worship. He demanded that even when an article was published with his name on it, that the Lord God Domitian says. And that's the way his correspondence was. And of course he had his images built throughout the empire, and he had temples built to himself because he wanted to be worshipped, and he claimed to be God. And of course he wasn't the first one. This goes way back for years to Augustus, even in 27 BC. So here we got over 100 years of history of where the Roman emperors were worshipped. But most of them, until after Nero, weren't worshipped while they were alive. They were worshipped after they died, and they were looked upon as deified. And there was a big ceremony of deification when an emperor died, that they would put his body on a pyre and they would light it, and as the smoke went up, his spirit was supposed to go into heaven and ascend upward, and he became a god at that time. And the Romans really believed this. And when the Christians refused to worship these images, they were accused of atheism and disloyalty and treason, and that was a great source of persecution, that the Romans did not think the Christians were good citizens because they would not worship the emperor, and they would not take part in the cult worship, and they were accused of being bad citizens. It's like we today accuse a segment of our society of being bad citizens, don't we? Why? Because they don't worship God. They worship their God, and they absolutely refuse to worship the God of heaven, and they will claim that anyone who does is an infidel, and he'll be put to death. And so, they can't be good citizens. Well, this is the way Christians were looked upon in the first century. And then this all began in Domitian's reign, that this persecution against Christianity in Domitian's reign in 95 AD had a religious aspect to it. Whereas before, it was not a religious thing, it was a social and moral thing. They accused the Christians of being immoral because Christians manifested such power and influence over not only their life but the lives of others. You take a person that you've never met before, and if you convert him to Christianity and you teach him that he must submit to Christ, then your influence over that person is looked upon weird by the Romans, like you're a witch and you have these secret powers, and they're afraid of you because of the power that you wield over people and the power over your own life. Because Christians would gladly, I don't say gladly, but they would willingly go to their death and not deny Christ, which showed the tremendous willpower they had. They had power over their own life, and they couldn't understand this. The Romans couldn't understand how anybody could have such power, and so they accused them of being witches and sorcerers and magicians, and they put them to death for that. They also accused them of cannibalism, being cannibal, because they came together on the first day of the week early in the morning, and they'd eat the body and drink the blood of someone, and they were accused of cannibalism. Of course, it's ignorance because they didn't understand what the Lord's Supper was. But in the eyes of the Romans, Christians were cannibalistic. They were also guilty of incest because a husband and wife may call each other brother and sister, and yet they have sexual relations, and they're guilty of incest. And so they were just all sorts of accusations that were made against Christians to prove that they were not good people, that you better stay away from them and don't mix and mingle with them because they were really bad people. They wouldn't go to the Christians, wouldn't go to the games, they wouldn't take part in the Roman citizens' way of life as far as their abusement is concerned. They stayed away from the idol worship. They wouldn't go to the animal sacrifices. They wouldn't eat and drink meat or blood that had been offered to idols. And so there were just a whole long list of accusations made against Christians that lended itself to swaying the population to persecute these people very easily. And this is what was at the root of these persecutions. It was a social, moral thing rather than a religious thing. Of course, to the Christians, it was religious persecution because they were being persecuted because they would not worship the emperor or his image. So to them it was religious, but to the Roman citizens it was a social, moral type thing, not religious. But that's the difference there. But Domitian's reign was the beginning of this widespread persecution outside of Rome, not just in Rome, but throughout the empire. And this is really what Revelation is all about, is this type of persecution. And so this is real strong evidence that Revelation was written during Domitian's reign. And we'll get into this more and more as we get into a verse-by-verse study of Revelation, because there are so many passages of Scripture in Revelation that will have to be interpreted in light of this persecution that's taking place. Any comment on that? Any comment? Of question. Okay, let's
Did
go.
Christians, did some of them have their heads cut off?
Oh, they were killed every way imaginable, and we'll get into that more and see that. We've got the testimony of the early writers. They're called church fathers. I don't like that name, but that's what all historians use to refer to this group of people, that they wrote mainly articles in defense of the charges against Christianity. So they were defenders of the gospel. And they were so early that some of them even began writing before the Apostle John died. So we've got very early writings of these church fathers that tell us that Revelation was written by John the Apostle as he was exiled on Patmos during the reign of Domitian. So we've got that evidence, which is very strong, because some of these church fathers, like Irenaeus, he wrote towards the end of, he said that John wrote the Gospel of Revelation, the letter of Revelation toward the end of Domitian's reign. And Irenaeus wrote in 120 to 202 AD. John probably died probably around 100. Maybe he lived as far as 105. But and Irenaeus knew some of John's pupils.
Is there any history to give us an idea of how John got off of that Isle of Patmos?
Yes, Bertha's question was, do we have any idea of how John got off of the island of Patmos? And the answer is he was released. Yeah, he was released, and supposedly came back to Ephesus and died there at Ephesus. We have secular history for that.
He had to get back somehow to give us what he saw, give us Revelation.
Well, no, he wrote Revelation and sent it out as a circular letter, and we'll get into that. He sent it out by courier, I guess, and they went a total of 333 miles from all these churches in delivering this letter, and we'll get into that more. And then we've got Clement of Alexandria, who wrote about 193 AD, and he said, in fact, this answers Bertha's question, he said that John, who wrote the book of Revelation, was released from exile to Patmos toward the end of the tyrant's death. Now, Clement doesn't say who the tyrant is, but Eusebius, who wrote from 260 to 341, identified the tyrant that Clement talked about as being Domitian. And I would know of no other that would fulfill that description like Domitian would. In fact, we'll get into that more in the book of Revelation itself. And then we have one other, Victorinus, who was was martyred by Diocletian in 303. He was put to death because he was a Christian, and Victorinus commented on chapter 10, verse 11. And let's go to Revelation 10:11. In his comments on this verse, he says, chapter 10, verse 11 says, "And he said unto me, Thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings." Now, in commenting on that, he said, when John said these things, he was in the Isle of Patmos, condemned to the labor of the mines by Caesar Domitian. There, therefore, he saw the apocalypse. And so, of course, Victorinus lived uh, some 200 years after John, but he had at his disposal writings which we don't have, because there were many writings available to these early church fathers that have become extinct, and we no longer have them. But we know of them because they talked about them. They would write about these things, but we don't have that writing itself. So there's 4 different early church fathers that give evidence that John wrote Revelation during the reign of Domitian. Now, I don't want to paint the picture that all the church fathers agreed with that. They didn't. Some of them thought that it was written under Nero's reign. But the evidence for that, in my opinion, is not nearly as strong as the evidence for Domitian's reign. So I didn't really spend a lot of time to bring that out in class. But it does exist, and I want you to know that it does exist. So it may be something that you want to study in more depth on your own. And if you have access to a computer, you can go to a computer and go to Google and just type in church fathers and hit it, and you'll get page after page after page of information about these men, when they lived, who they were, what they wrote. And you've got all kinds of information. If you Google Nero's persecution against Christians, Domitian's persecution against Christians, you'll get page after page of information, and you'll never get it all read because there's so much to it. You've got to kind of go through and pick and choose what you're going to use. I've spent all day today, and started at 4:30 this morning, just reading on the 7 churches of Asia. And I mean, I've just got so much material that we can only present a small part of it in class. But if you go to your computer, go to Google, and you Google the 7 churches of Asia, or the church at Ephesus, the church at Smyrna, the church at Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, any of those, you'll just bring up oodles and gobs of information that you can just sit there and read. And it's very fascinating to me. I just get so interested in it, I lose track of time, and I look up and 3 or 4 hours have passed. But this information is just abundant. We live in a good time for Bible study. And if you don't have a computer and know how to Google something, you ought to get you one, because there's a wealth of information there in anything about Bible study. Of course, you got to be careful, because a lot of this information is written by people that teach and believe false doctrine, especially on premillennialism. And it's just rife, premillennial doctrine. But I've studied that, and I believe with all my heart that's false, so it doesn't bother me. I come to a premillennial thing, I just skip over it. I just go through it, because I know there are arguments and I don't agree with them. So there's no need in wasting my time on it. Okay, is any comment on the early writers, the church fathers? Well, another source of information, this is internal here, is the letters to the 7 churches themselves. If we take the information that John wrote to each church, let's take Ephesians, for example. What was Ephesians' problem? I mean, they've got a long list of commendations. I mean, they were workers, and they just did everything, but they had one problem. What was it?
They didn't believe in Christ.
Huh?
They left their first love.
Yeah, they left their first love. Now, stop and think about this. The Apostle Paul worked at Ephesus longer than any place he had ever been, any one place. about 3 years. He sent Timothy back there twice to work. In 68, when Jerusalem was being destroyed, the Christians got out of Jerusalem, and the Apostle John came there and stayed from about 68, 69 until he was exiled in Patmos, all the way to 94 or so. So he was there all these years. Can you feature the church in Ephesus leaving its first love while John was there? I can't even imagine. John is known as the apostle of love. That's what he's called. He's the apostle of love. How in the world, and if you read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the theme there is love. Love, 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 love. Over and over and over again. He could not allow that to happen. And this is very strong evidence that the book of Revelation was written after John left there, and the church at Ephesus left their first love after his departure. I think that's strong evidence myself. And what about Smyrna? It's a time. Oh my. Okay. Well, we'll stop there, and we'll pick up here, Lord's willing, the next Sunday morning with considering this internal evidence for the day. And the reason we're spending so much time on this is important, because whichever date you decide on is going to go a long way towards how you interpret certain passages in Revelation. And we'll talk more about that when we get to that. Any comment before we close? Well, thank you very much for your attention and participation in class.